We would like to send out a special thanks to our new sponsor, Wink, for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the U.S. a $22 credit plus free shipping on their first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. So please visit trywink.com/cold. That's trywinc.com/cold. Thank you and enjoy the show.
September 13th, 1992, Boston, Massachusetts. While working as the ramp supervisor for Northwest Airlines at Logan International Airport, 27-year-old Su Taraskiewicz leaves in the middle of her shift to purchase food for her crew. She never returns and is found murdered inside the trunk of her car the following morning. 1 year later, Su's mother finds her diary and reads that Su was the victim of nonstop sexual harassment at her workplace. Some of Su's harassers would be indicted for their role in a credit card theft ring, but the identity of her killer remains unknown. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and yes, you are listening to the correct podcast. I'm sure you might have been thrown off there for a second by the sound of an unfamiliar voice narrating the intro, but that's because I recently held a contest for our listeners in which the winner would earn the opportunity to record themselves reading our podcast's opening spiel. The victor was a listener named Casey James, who did a phenomenal job, so thank you, Casey. I plan to make this contest a recurring monthly thing, so more of you listeners will have the chance to say, after that, the trail went cold, in front of the entire world. Casey also requested that I cover an unsolved murder from her hometown on the podcast. While there isn't enough available material to do an entire episode about the case, I will briefly discuss it near the end of this show. Anyway, the main case I'm going to be covering today also happened to be featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1992 murder of Su Taraskiewicz. This case is a request from a listener named Lori, and while I only received it about a month and a half ago, I decided to bump this case to the front of the line because the day of this episode's release, September 13th, officially marks the 25-year anniversary of Su's murder. And when you learn the circumstances of what happened, it's going to seem pretty unbelievable that this case has been unsolved for 25 years, because there are probably quite a few people out there who know the truth about what happened. This is a pretty maddening story of a woman who found success in a male-dominated industry, but some people just could not handle that, so she was tormented for years by a non-stop stream of sexual harassment. It's been up for debate whether the harassment itself was the primary motive for Su's murder, or if she was killed because of illegal activity going on in her workplace. This is a pretty disturbing story, but it needs to be told. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes like this one and shorter minisodes. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on our website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the unsolved murder of Su Taraskiewicz. Our story begins in Boston in 1992. Our central figure is 27-year-old Susan Taraskiewicz, who goes by the name Su. Su lives in Saugus and is currently an employee at Northwest Airlines and works at Boston's Logan International Airport. She has pretty much broken new ground by achieving success in a very male-dominated industry. Su started out her career at Northwest in 1987 by cleaning the interiors of jets, and became a ground service employee within the next 2 years, only the second woman in the history of the company to ever hold that position. She continued working her way up the ladder, and eventually earned a promotion to the position of Equipment Service Crew Chief. Her job involved supervising ramp workers who unloaded mail and baggage from the airplanes, and this time, Su became the very first woman to ever hold such a position at Northwest. On the evening of Saturday, September 12th, Su showed up to work the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. graveyard shift with her crew. Sometime around 1 a.m. on the 13th, she volunteered to go on a food run to a nearby sandwich shop. After taking orders from her co-workers and leaving the airport, Su did not return for the rest of her shift. On the morning of September 14th, Su's car was found parked at an auto body shop in nearby Revere, and when a passerby noticed blood dripping from the trunk, the police were notified. When the vehicle's trunk was opened, Su's body was inside. She had been beaten and stabbed multiple times. Su was not sexually assaulted, and the only item of hers which appeared to be missing was a necklace she usually wore. So what could have been the motive for her murder? Well, from the outset, alarm bells were raised when Su's family learned that even after she failed to return from her sandwich run on her shift, no one attempted to report her missing for the next 36 hours, even when Su failed to show up at all for her next shift later that evening. Instead, her time card was marked to indicate that she completed a shift like normal and then returned to work on her next shift. Some of Su's co-workers would state that they only did this to cover for her so she wouldn't get into trouble, even though Su had never missed a shift without explanation during her entire tenure with the company. In spite of this odd piece of business, the investigation into Su's murder went nowhere and failed to turn up any solid leads for over a year. However, Su's mother, Logan Taraskiewicz, soon made a shocking discovery which took the investigation in an entirely new direction. For a long time after Su's murder, Marlene could not handle the grief of going into her daughter's room, but finally decided to do so around Christmas time in 1993. Marlene found a briefcase inside the closet containing Su's diary, but when she opened it, Marlene was horrified to read her daughter describe many disturbing accounts of sexual harassment which took place at her workplace in 1989. According to the diary, Su faced this harassment because her male co-workers did not like the idea of a woman entering their world. Su had never told her family about any of this, so Marlene was forced to read about the harassment in the diary. On numerous occasions, Su discovered explicit and demeaning graffiti written about her at the airport, usually in the men's room. At one point, she found a nude drawing of her in a sexual position in the cargo hold of one of the jets. Su frequently filed complaints with the management at Northwest Airlines and her union, the International Association of Machinists, but very little was ever done to stop the harassment, and the union often advised her not to rock the boat. In fact, a common response to Su's complaints from management would be to assign her unappealing jobs, such as cleaning and emptying the airline toilets. Other female employees at Northwest would corroborate Su's stories, claiming that some of the men there went out of their way to create a hostile work environment. Some of their tactics included using derogatory language to describe Su and other women, scattering pornographic magazines throughout the lunchroom, and hanging women's undergarments and feminine hygiene products from the ceiling. Even though Su's diary would only chronicle the harassment which took place until near the end of 1989, her family would learn that it continued to escalate in the ensuing years. It spread outside of her workplace, as Su's car was vandalized, and she started getting anonymous threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. On one occasion, when Su launched a complaint about her co-worker's behavior, her sister's car was vandalized in her driveway. If any of Su's co-workers, both male and female, attempted to support her, they would find their own vehicles vandalized, and even receive death threats. In spite of this hellish situation, Su continued to perform stellar work for Northwest, and applied for the position of Equipment Service Crew Chief. Another male employee in Su's union initially got the job instead of her, but then she discovered that he had illegally bid for the position. So Su filed a grievance about this, and after she won, the job was hers, and she was officially promoted in February of 1992. Well, not surprisingly, There were some male employees who had serious issues with the idea of a woman being in a supervisory position, so things became even more tense at work. There continued to be graffiti written about Sue, but it became more threatening. At one point, Sue opened her locker and discovered that a drawing of a coffin with her name on it had been scrawled inside. Once again, Sue attempted to report this issue to the higher-ups at Northwest, but when things did not go well during a meeting, she broke down crying. She later told a female coworker that she was ashamed for crying in front of them, but was not going to quit because that would send the message that the harassers had won and only make things more difficult for other women who entered the industry. In the weeks preceding her death, Sue apparently told friends that she was in fear for her life. Well, needless to say, all these revelations about Sue's years of constant workplace harassment opened up a potential motive for her murder, so her family started making waves. Sue's parents, Marlene and Ronald Taraskiewicz, eventually took legal action by filing a complaint with the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination about the failure of Northwest Airlines and the International Association of Machinists to stop the harassment against their daughter. However, it turned out there might have been an altogether different reason for Sue's death. During the summer of 1992, a federal investigation was launched against Northwest Airlines because it turned out that some of their baggage handlers were participating in a stolen credit card ring which netted over $7 million. It was a massive investigation involving the FBI, the Secret Service, and the U.S. Postal Service. Whenever a Northwest jet transported shipments of new credit cards from Minneapolis to Boston, which were supposed to be delivered to customers, these handlers would steal some of the cards from the mail bags. The people involved in this scheme would generate phony driver's licenses which matched the names on these cards, which were then used for nefarious purposes. One of their biggest scams was to use the cards to take out large cash advances at casinos, and they would sometimes use this money to gamble there and make more money. Other times, the stolen cards would be sold off through a fence. The advantage here is that the cards were stolen in transit, so the thieves would have several days to profit off them before the customers noticed their cards hadn't arrived yet. 1 month before Sue's murder, several baggage handlers were subpoenaed to testify in front of a federal grand jury. In the end, 37 people were indicted and convicted on federal charges for their involvement in this scheme, and 10 of them were baggage handlers at Northwest. In fact, some of them just happened to be named in Sue's diary as employees who had been sexually harassing her. 2 of these people really stood out. One of them was Joseph Nuzzo, the ringleader among the baggage handlers, who wound up getting a 3-year prison sentence. In 1989, Sue filed a harassment complaint about Nuzzo after she attempted to break up a fistfight between him and 2 other employees, and he responded by calling her a very derogatory term. Nuzzo soon wound up getting fired from Northwest, though he was hired back 6 months later under a last chance policy. By the sound of things, Nuzzo had committed a number of disciplinary infractions, and the incident involving Sue in the fistfight was not the only reason he got fired, but he seemed to hold a massive grudge against Sue, and was believed to be the instigator of some of the worst harassment against her, including the vandalism of her car and the threatening phone calls. When the subpoenas were handed down in the credit card ring investigation in August of 1992, Nuzzo was fired from Northwest for good, and reportedly told people that he believed Sue was a snitch who had ratted them out to the authorities. However, the investigation concluded that Sue had no involvement or knowledge of the credit card ring and had never been asked to assist in the investigation or testify in front of a grand jury. Another participant in this scheme who was named in Sue's diary was a baggage handler named Bobby Brooks. Sue and Bobby apparently had a brief affair, but he became increasingly hostile towards her after it ended, particularly when she became involved with another coworker. Things reached a boiling point after an incident in the break room where Bobby grabbed Sue's radio and smashed it on the floor. Sue's boyfriend at the time confronted Bobby and demanded he replace the radio. When Sue confronted Bobby about this herself, he blew her off and threatened to beat up and kill her boyfriend. Anyway, when the subpoenas came down in 1992, Brooks immediately requested a transfer, moved out of state, and got a job as a baggage handler at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. He was eventually indicted in the credit card scheme, and in exchange for testifying against Joseph Nuzzo, he received a sentence of 3 years probation. When questioned about Sue's murder, Brooks claimed he was working the late shift at Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport on the night she was killed, and that he never had any communication with Nuzzo at all that entire weekend. Well, in 1997, Brooks found himself in hot water again when he was indicted on 3 counts of perjury and 2 counts of obstruction of justice. It turns out that his alleged alibi for Sue's murder was not exactly rock solid, as time cards showed that he was not actually working at the airport that night. And even though Brooks had testified under oath that he had no communication with Joseph Nuzzo, there were records of a phone conversation between them on the same day Sue was killed. In the end, Brooks agreed to plead guilty to obstruction of justice and was sentenced to 15 months in prison, but as part of his plea bargain, he would not have to face further questioning about Sue's murder. Anyway, after the Taraskiewicz family filed their sexual harassment complaint against Northwest Airlines, the two sides eventually settled on a $75,000 payout, and Northwest agreed to put up a $250,000 reward for information in this case. Sadly, Sue's death took a huge toll on her parents' marriage, as Marlene and Ronald Taraskiewicz eventually divorced. Ronald has since passed away, but Marlene still works diligently to keep her daughter's case in the spotlight. Every year on the anniversary of Sue's murder, Marlene holds a solitary vigil outside Logan Airport while carrying a sign containing all the information about the case. And in recent years, she is paid to put up billboards throughout the Boston area featuring Sue's photograph and contact info for the authorities. In addition to being featured on Unsolved Mysteries and Dateline, this story also inspired a 2003 episode of Law & Order Criminal Intent titled Baggage, about a female airline baggage supervisor who was murdered after enduring constant harassment from her male coworkers. But unlike the episode, the real-life story would not have a conclusive ending. Unfortunately, after 25 years, there are still no answers about who actually killed Susan Taraskiewicz. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to tell you about our new sponsor, Wink, as we are very excited that they are fans of the show. We often share some very creepy and intense stories on this podcast, so sipping a nice glass of wine while you listen to us would be the ideal way to help you relax. Wink is targeting a new generation of wine drinkers who want to do away with the pretense and simply enjoy reasonably priced, great wine. Wink custom tailors wines to the tastes of the individual consumer and delivers 3 bottles of wine each month to your doorstep for $39 plus a flat $6 shipping rate. When you visit Wink and take their 20-second palate profile quiz, you'll get instant wine recommendations based on your unique profile. The price point for most wines is $13, so by signing up with Wink, you are getting your first bottle for free. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the US a $20 credit, plus free shipping on your first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. Your wine delivery will be branded Wink. Wink is the wine club associated with Wink. Tonight, I enjoyed a nice 2016 bottle of Alma Libre Red Blend. Alma Libre is produced from grapes which are grown in the Colchagua Valley in Chile. It has an earthy, spicy flavor and is great with dinner, particularly if your main course is meat, like beef or pork. Wink's website recommended this wine to me after I took their quiz, and their recommendation was right on the money. And because I ordered from them, I also have 3 other bottles of wine which are just as good. Like I said earlier, this particular brand of wine would be an ideal companion for you while listening to this podcast. So to receive a $20 credit and free shipping on 4 bottles of wine on your first order, go to trywink.com/cold. That's trywink.com/cold. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. Yes, this is a pretty horrible story about a good person who did not deserve all the horrible things which happened to her. Out of all the victims I've featured on this podcast, there aren't many whom I've admired more than Su Taraskiewicz. This is a woman who decided to enter an industry where females were not welcome and had to suffer through years of brutal harassment. But in spite of this, she persevered and still managed to climb the ladder and get promoted to a position which no woman had ever held in the history of that company. I think that says a lot about the quality of her work, considering how many people there were looking to undermine her at every opportunity. When she was wrongfully passed over for the promotion, Su decided to file a grievance in order to obtain it, even though she must have known there would be a tremendous backlash to this. After everything Su went through, no one would have blamed her if she decided to quit, but she held strong because she believed walking away would only make things more difficult for other women who dealt with the same thing, and I think that says an awful lot about her character. Unfortunately, Northwest Airlines dropped the ball in a huge way when it came to dealing with this whole situation. What does it say when they fire someone like Joseph Nuzzo, allow him to come back 6 months later, and then he winds up masterminding a stolen credit card ring right under their noses? It never should have gotten to that point. But I think the most unsettling thing about this murder is that there have to be quite a few people who know the full truth about what happened. When Marlene Taraskiewicz was interviewed during the Unsolved Mystery segment, she said, "It's been 3 years now, and all we need is for someone to come forward." So it's pretty sad that during the last few years, Marlene has been appearing in videos on the Massachusetts State Police's YouTube channel and has pretty much been saying the exact same thing, except that instead of 3 years, it's now 22 years, or 24 years. Quite simply, the wall of silence surrounding Su's murder is pretty disturbing. Now, given that she was killed while going on a food run in the middle of the night, I guess it's not completely impossible that after leaving the airport, she could have crossed paths with some random stranger who killed her, and her death had nothing to do with anything going on at her workplace. But given the circumstances, I find that highly doubtful. But it's just insane to me that Su could disappear while in the midst of working a shift, yet nobody made any attempt to report her missing for 36 hours. It would be one thing if Su had told all her coworkers that she was leaving for a while to take care of some personal business and then didn't return, but she was going out to buy sandwiches and took orders from everyone. Did none of them find it the least bit suspicious that Su did not return with their food? Not only that, but the response was to alter her time cards to make it look like she worked the rest of her shift, and when she failed to show up for her next shift, they did the exact same thing. I know they claim this was done to cover for Su, so she wouldn't get into trouble, but I don't buy this at all. By all accounts, it was very uncharacteristic behavior for her, and she never slacked off from work like that, so the whole thing really should have raised some red flags immediately. And while I know that Su did have supporters at her workplace, and not everyone there hated her, the co-workers who did hate her really hated her. Given all the hostility which was caused by Su's promotion, and the amount of men who were just appalled by the idea of having to take orders from a woman, you can bet that some of them would have jumped on any opportunity to report her insubordination to management. If Su just left in the middle of the shift, and didn't come back, and then proceeded to no-show her next shift without explanation, there's no way they would attempt to protect her by altering her time cards. No, there was definitely a calculated cover-up among the employees there to explain Su's absence. I'm willing to believe that those who weren't actually complicit in the cover-up were probably frightened into staying silent. This is the main reason why it's shocking that Su's murder has remained unsolved for 25 years. There have to be multiple people who know exactly what happened to her, and some of them probably do feel guilty about it, but are still afraid to come forward. So since it seems pretty clear that Su's murder was caused by something from her workplace, the big question is, was the motive related to her sexual harassment, or the stolen credit card ring? Well, both of them are distinct possibilities, but Su was harassed nonstop for years and had her life threatened on several occasions. While I'm sure it was a personal hell for her, it doesn't look like anyone actually followed through on their threats. Yet only 1 month after the subpoenas are handed down in the credit card investigation, Su winds up being murdered. I just don't think that's a coincidence. Not to mention that the crime took place shortly after Joseph Nuzzo had his employment in Northwest terminated for good, and after Bobby Brooks transferred to a new position in Minneapolis. I think it's pretty damning that Brooks would be willing to testify and help secure a conviction against Nuzzo in the credit card case in order to avoid jail time, yet he still decided to perjure himself and negate the limited immunity agreement he received. I've read the court documents, and when called upon to testify in front of a grand jury related to Sue's murder, Brooks still maintained that he was working in Minneapolis on the night she was killed and had no contact with Nuzzo that weekend. He was given the chance to recant or change his testimony while under oath, yet he still stuck to his original story, and when concrete evidence was produced to show Brooks was lying, he wound up going to prison. I just see no reason for Brooks to have perjured himself like this, unless he knew something really incriminating. Now, the investigation did produce time cards which showed that Brooks wasn't at work on the night of Sue's murder, but it doesn't look like they uncovered any evidence that he was in Boston, and Boston is a long way from Minneapolis. So I'm not sure Brooks would have participated in the actual murder, but at the very least, I think he spoke to Nuzzo about it and knew what happened. Unfortunately, as part of his plea deal, he got to avoid being questioned any further about Sue's death, so that was a major blow for the investigation. Now, Joseph Nuzzo had a bigger motive than anybody to murder Sue, and he'd held a grudge against her since she played a role in getting him fired for 6 months in 1989, and it seems clear that he was the source of some of the worst harassment she received. And most importantly, he seemed to think that Sue was working as an informant for the authorities in the credit card investigation and could potentially send him to prison. Nuzzo definitely sounds like the number one suspect, but what isn't so clear is how many people might have been involved in this murder. Well, let's not forget that this credit card scheme was not just limited to 10 baggage handlers at Northwest Airlines. Altogether, there were no less than 37 people involved, and a lot of them seemed like pretty shady characters. As an example, there's this guy named Arthur Rizzo, who served 5 years in prison for his involvement in this scam. In 2006, he made the news again after he was busted as part of an identity theft ring which involved him and his accomplices impersonating Homeland Security officials and calling up immigrants to obtain their personal information, such as their credit card or social security numbers. And while I can't 100% confirm their authenticity, I've also read rumors online that the mob might have been involved in the stolen credit card ring. If that was true, and Nuzzo told some higher-ups in organized crime that Sue was a rat, and responsible for the indictments which were about to be handed down, then I can see a contract being put out on her life. It's possible that Nuzzo did not actually commit the murder himself, and that a professional was sent to do it. But then again, I think a contract killer would have simply shot her and not gone through the trouble of beating and stabbing her several times. This crime suggested a very personal killing. I've always wondered why the killer didn't decide to murder Sue while she was off duty, because luring her to her death in the middle of a shift is going to attract a lot of attention. However, that might have been their intention all along. Having Sue just disappear like that would send a message to her coworkers to keep quiet if they didn't want to suffer the same fate. And if true, that strategy obviously worked, because her absence was covered up, and it seems like everyone from her crew has kept their mouths shut. One key piece of information I've always found curious are the claims that Sue received a phone call from an unknown person shortly before she left on her food run. Her mother has always believed that this call might have been from someone she trusted who lured her to her death. Given what she'd been through the past several years, Sue would have been very cautious about going to meet someone alone in the middle of the night, so there is a lot of credence to that theory. Remember, neither Joseph Nuzzo nor Bobby Brooks were still working at Logan Airport at this time, so how would they know when she was leaving to go get food, unless someone told them? It does seem like multiple people besides Nuzzo and Brooks were complicit in Sue's murder, so it is possible that at least one of them was a person she trusted. I'd like to think that the explanation here is a fairly simple one, and that Nuzzo and possibly one or two other people were the sole architects of this crime, and that there's no grand conspiracy involving the mafia or organized crime. But the fact of the matter is that Sue just disappeared in the middle of her shift, and none of her coworkers did anything about it. I'm not sure all those people would have kept their mouths shut this long if all they had to worry about was Joseph Nuzzo, especially since he went to prison shortly after this. If Sue's murder was motivated by the credit card ring, then that makes her story even more tragic. Investigators have made it very clear that Sue was not involved in this scheme, was not acting as an informant for them, and had not been subpoenaed to testify. It seems pretty likely that Sue knew nothing about it at all, though given what I've heard about her character, she probably would have gone to the authorities if she did find out. But Nuzzo had a major personal vendetta against Sue, so I'm sure he would have jumped on the opportunity to label her a rat, even if there was no reason to believe that was true. Even if Nuzzo did not commit the crime himself, he may have put Sue's life at serious risk with those false claims. If so, that just adds an extra level of awfulness to this story, as a courageous woman had to deal with rampant sexism and harassment for years, still managed to persevere, but then may have ultimately been murdered because of something she had absolutely nothing to do with. I'm really glad that Marlene Taraskiewicz will not give up, and keeps going the extra mile to keep her daughter's story out there, because in spite of all the time which has passed, this case is still solvable. All it might take is for the right person to come forward and talk. So if you have any information on the unsolved murder of Su Taraskiewicz, please call the Suffolk County Police Detective Unit at 617-727-8817. That's 617-727-8817. So before we come to a close, I'd also like to take a few moments to talk about a cold case which the winner of our contest, Casey, requested I feature on the podcast. Like I said earlier, there isn't enough material here for an entire episode, but it's a pretty frightening story, and I'm happy to give it some exposure. The case in question took place near Casey's hometown of Dolgeville, a small village in upstate New York, a place which is not exactly known for unsolved murders. But shortly after midnight on August 8, 1968, 25-year-old Donna Hart phoned her father, Richard Carla, and told him that a man wearing a stocking on his head was attempting to break into her house, which was located just outside of Dolgeville. Richard immediately rushed over there and arrived within 5 minutes, only to hear gunshots coming from inside the house. The front door was locked, so Richard went around to enter through the south side door, which had been broken open with a gunshot. Richard rushed upstairs, proceeded to find Donna dead inside the closet of a spare bedroom. She'd attempted to hide there, but the killer still found her, and shot her 4 times with a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. By the time police arrived, the front door was unlocked, which meant the killer had exited the house that way, just as Richard was entering through the side door. They only missed each other by seconds, and Richard claimed he heard a vehicle speed away while he was tending to his daughter. Investigators would discover tire tracks to indicate that the killer's vehicle had been parked on another road 350 yards away from the house. Anyway, that's about all the info you'll find out there about Donna Hart's murder, as numerous leads were pursued and hundreds of people were interviewed, but no resolution has been found. It's worth noting that Donna had separated from her estranged husband only 4 months earlier, but I have no idea if he was ever considered a serious suspect, or if any evidence pointed towards him. New articles about this case were published last year featuring Donna's mother, Virginia Carla, who was 94 years old at the time. If Virginia is still alive today, there is still hope that she can live long enough to see justice obtained for her daughter's murder. So if you have any information about the unsolved murder of Donna Hart, please call the New York State Police Troop D Major Crimes Unit at 315-366-6003. That's 315-366-6003. So that's about it for this episode. A big thanks once again to Casey for suggesting this case and doing a tremendous job with our very first guest listener voiceover. Like I said in the intro, I'm going to be making this a recurring contest and doing at least one episode per month in which one of our listeners can win the opportunity to narrate the opening spiel for The Trail Went Cold. I'm going to be doing a random drawing to pick our next winner very soon. If you already entered last month and did not win, you will remain in the running to be chosen this time, so there's no need to enter again. However, if you haven't entered yet and wish to do so for our next contest, all you have to do is send me an email under the heading Trail Went Cold Contest and name the one unsolved cold case you would most want to see featured on this podcast. I'm making it a point to do at least one episode per month from my list of suggested cases. So once again, if you want to enter, just send me an email with the heading Trail Went Cold Contest to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Before we close things off, I'd like to play a promo for the podcast The Minds of Madness. The host, Tyler, is a fellow Canadian, and in the span of less than a year, this podcast has already become a tremendous success. Have a listen.
What could an American dad, a university professor, and a passenger on a bus possibly have in common? You can find out by listening to the Minds of Madness podcast, where we uncover the series of events and state of mind leading ordinary people to do unthinkable things. The Minds of Madness is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher, and all other major podcast apps.
So a big thanks to all my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. We also got a very generous new donation this week from a listener named Cass, so thank you very much, Cass. I need to provide another big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a new Facebook discussion group for The Trail Went Cold, in which myself and our listeners discuss the podcast, our featured cases, and true crime in general. So feel free to join anytime, and I'll approve your entry into the group ASAP. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold.